Sehr geehrte
Ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, I would like to welcome you most warmly to this event of the Open Forum. As in the past few days and years, there seems to be a lot of interest, so thank you very much for having taken the trouble to join us this afternoon. Very often, discussions are held under the label of existential issues, and this discussion is definitely going to be about existence. That is to say, how can we shape our dying and to what extent we can determine this ourselves. In past years, these discussions in Switzerland came up under the heading of death tourism, and I'm sure if you live in Switzerland you follow this. We'd like to extend the debate a bit and include subjects such as palliative care and perhaps also some philosophical aspects regarding dying and death. I am very pleased to introduce to you the panelists who will be discussing these issues together with you in the next 1.5 hours. We have here with us Mrs. Evelyn Widmer-Schlumpf, who is Federal Counsel of Justice and Police of the Swiss Confederation. Her department is preparing a bill on assisted death in legal terms. On my left, Petra de Jong. She is the CEO of the Dutch Association for the Right to Die. It's an association which provides information about the possibilities of assisted death. We'll come back to the very Dutch model later on. It's important to know that Mrs. de Jong was a specialist in the treatment of lung diseases. Monica Rentz is a musicologist and psychotherapist. She has worked for more than 10 years in the management department of psycho-oncology at the Cantonal Hospital in St. Gall, and in this time she has accompanied and helped and assisted those who were dying and their relatives and close friends in this difficult time. Then we have Mr. Hans-Jürgen Münk. He's professor for Theological Ethics at the University of Lucerne, and he also is at the head of the Institute of Social Ethics. And Thomas Wipp, President of the Council Federation of Swiss Protestant Churches, the organization that is co-organizing this open forum together here with where he is a parson and therefore confronted with these issues of helping those who are dying in his daily work. Now, since I assume that this is a subject that cannot just be debated in a theoretical way and in isolation from our practical experience, I would like to ask from the panelists whether any of them have had a personal experience that has marked them particularly in connection with this subject. Mrs. Federal Counsellor? Yes, ladies and gentlemen, I've had such experiences. In particular, when my grandmother died, being at her side until her death, she was over 90 years old. She was healthy most of her life, but in the last months of her life, she was very sick, so that we as a whole family were able to be at her side, and that impressed me very much. My grandmother was able to accept this. She had always been of the opinion that this was going that dying was going to be part of her life, was part of her life. She accepted this. And I was also very impressed by the passive help that was given to her at the hospital so that it was made easier for her to live. You mean passive help, that no life-prolonging treatment was given? Yes, exactly. That was her specific wish, and we also accepted this, we, her family. This was very impressive. Thomas Wipp, have you had any such experiences in your personal life? One of the reasons why I studied theology after I finished my schooling was that I lost two brothers and sisters, a brother and a sister, a brother to cancer, and this was a very, very, had a deep effect on our family and on my personal life. And as a parson, I've always had to deal with such situations, either help the relatives or those who took care of the dying person. Mrs. Rentz, probably in your professional life you have a lot of such experiences, but what about experiences in your personal life? Is there something you would like to tell us? Well, this is something I experience nearly every day in my profession. People who suffer and who have disfiguring afflictions experience this in different ways. There are very subjective differences. You can feel quite well if you can morally let go. And then there was another experience that I had in helping a relative, assisting a relative. Mrs. de Jong, what personal experiences do you have?
Advanced that I'm talking English. I can understand German, but I prefer to talk English, so I hope you can understand, and it is translated, I think. As you said already, I've been a pulmonologist for 20 years, and pulmonologists have lots to do with end-of-life situations. And in that situations, I have had some experience with performing euthanasia, for instance. And all the times that I have done that was in a very warm situation with a relationship with my patient, but also with his family or her family. And it was a nice way of dying. And although I know that there is no right way to die, everybody wants to keep his own dignity in dying. And so choices in making how to perform life, but also how to perform dying, is something that I continue now in my work as a CEO from the Dutch Right to Die Society.
Mhm. Herzlichen Dank. Hier muss man vielleicht wirklich kurz anfügen.
Thank you. Perhaps one should add briefly very here, and Mrs. de Jong will be able to explain this later on. In Holland, there are some very strict conditions that allow doctors exclusively to give such active assistance to death. This is prohibited quite explicitly in Switzerland, so there are some very special circumstances that are indicated. Professor Münk, any personal experience? Federal Councillor, ladies and gentlemen, I was able to experience this in my own life nearly 50 years ago when my grandfather died, who died quite peacefully. He smoked a lot until very shortly before his death, and he turned nearly 88. Once he had to stop smoking, we knew that the end was nigh. He did have experienced terrible pain, and he wanted to die holding my hand. It was, of course, a very sad event. He had looked after me a lot. He even gave me a bicycle 3 weeks before he died. I worked as a parson for 3 years, and in that time I was able to help 4 people who were dying. In most cases, the death was expected and peaceful and well prepared, so I cannot speak about any traumatic experience in this area. Thank you, Mr. Münk. So these are some personal experiences. Let's have an open discussion now. I was very surprised to read recently that apparently in Switzerland 50% of most cases of death are due to an end-of-life decision of a doctor or a physician. It is a physician who then takes such a decision that then brings about death. So I thought that most cases of death were, in inverted commas, natural deaths. So what does this mean? What is the implication for us in our discussion? Does anyone wish to respond? Mr. Wipp? I think that's an observation that we can all make. Because of the technological possibilities of modern medicine and all the other technological possibilities, we live for longer, and that the process of dying takes longer, that natural dying or natural death, which still exists and which we know about, has now led over to a process where decisions have to be taken at all sorts of levels. So one has to decide when natural life is no longer possible. The decision is very difficult because it all depends on what is feasible. That is why we have to talk about this last part of our life of living, and that is death. How do we shape it? Mrs. Renz? The more medicine is able to preserve life, the more medicine must be able to take these decisions to let someone die. That is why these decisions are taken a little more deliberately than in the past, because there's more leeway, there's more potential. So there's more passive death assistance, that is to say, letting people die, and also the active help with the use of medication, which as a side effect shorten life. That is simply must be part of a good palliative medicine. So you're saying that this is part of commonplace in the process of dying, that decisions are taken that have a direct effect on the death of a person? Federal Councillor? Yes. I think it's very understandable, given today's situation. More people are dying as a result of disease and treatment, and therefore medical decisions have taken much more priority and more weight and are more decisive. If you look at these 50% of the deaths, you will find that most of these deaths will be due to non-life prolonging treatment, because people don't want to continue to life, or because there is active death assistance. I think this is perfectly understandable given our social development and the development of our society. In the past, one stayed at home and there were no medical possibilities to take such a decision. I think that is the central point, the question of active decisions being taken. These decisions have to be taken. So who takes these decisions? Who assumes this responsibility of deciding when death should take place? Is this a question of self-determination? I think that's a very important area as far as you're concerned, Mrs. de Jong. This question of who determines should every individual be able to determine him and herself when the time of his or her death should take place?
Situation in the Netherlands, we have a multiform society, and we respect the self-determination that every human being with legal boundaries, of course, must have the possibility to choose for himself or herself. And so the decision is with the patient. And that is what our the NVVE stands for, that the patient is informed in which possibilities he or she can choose, what the consequences are, so that everybody is able to make a well-determined decision, to make a decision that you know what is coming up to you. And that's I think the main issue, that it is voluntary, and that the self-choosing possibilities are there and can be performed.
Und das müsste eigentlich.
And this definition would really be in direct opposition with the theological point of view, where one considers that life is a gift given by God, and that one cannot determine oneself when one can return it to God. So my question to the theologians, what would they like to say? May I perhaps respond to what was said before on this issue of passive and active? I think that this is a tragedy, a verbal tragedy. One can subdivide actions by doctors as doing and omitting, but I think it's also decisive to realize that in the case of active assisted death, the doctor decides on the action of causing death simply by giving the appropriate medication. If the doctor turns off the machine or stops a certain treatment or reduces it or whatever, then the doctor has taken necessary action that either alleviates death, but it's not sufficient because there are other causes as well, as, for example, the natural course of the disease. So the doctor is not the only cause or the only decisive cause of death. So there are differences to be seen in terms of causality, and that's very important when one kills someone, which is, of course, a matter of highest moral weight. Now, on this question of self-determination, that is a word that fits into the spectrum of autonomy. I think it's part of our ideals, this matter of self-determination. So I don't oppose it in principle, certainly not. However, if you take self-determination as the only yardstick, but then why not also at other times of your life when you're fed up with living? Why only when you've started to die, when you're at the stage of dying? So the doctor will have to evaluate whether the patient has already started on that phase of dying. So self-determination has to be respected. But this does not mean that one should be obliged to help someone who wants to commit suicide. No, says the moderator. But if you accept self-determination, then as a Catholic theologian, you would also accept death assistance, assisted death. That's not what I have said so far. Well, that's how I interpreted it. No, that's not correct. It's not a question whether someone has a right to commit suicide or not when we look at individual ethics and self-determination. We are looking at concepts of what is a good life, and there are all sorts of concepts that are very different and differ a lot. And when it comes to suffering, it's very difficult to to find your way around all these concepts, and the Federal Councillor, I think, has probably got enough material when it comes to preparing this bill. May I interrupt you and also ask the others who have a theologian's training? So what is this concept of a good life? I don't think that we have to impose on other people how to interpret that individually.
I think that there are three values that we can put in relationship to one another. I think the highest value is that of protecting life. From a Christian point of view, life is a gift of God, and the gift of life, death is an inevitable part of that. If you give up that principle, and we don't give it up when people are starving, we don't give it up when people are threatened in the streets or when we're fighting against war, we believe that people's lives have to be protected. But the situation which we're talking about is that ultimately we will become ill, we will suffer, we will be in pain, and we need to know, and this is my most important point, that this stage of life is something that is accompanied. We talk of palliative care. Palliative means a protective coat. We need to have this kind of guarantee. We should be allowed to die. That's the second thing. The third thing, which I would say isn't just culturally specific to the West, Mr. Münk, but is something which is in the Bible, perhaps something which is very Protestant, which is a respect for the responsibility of individuals. And I believe that the responsibility which people take to end their own lives is something we should be aware of. But individual responsibility is in the Bible, and I don't want to burden that with theology. We need to respect people's individual responsibility, and that goes together with the protection of the right to life and the other issues that I mentioned. Mr. Mertz? Yes, I have a theologian background, but I don't practice. I believe that in self-determination, it's very important to ask who has the responsibility. Self-determination is a very important value, which reflects individuals with a mature conscience. They shouldn't be manipulated towards a decision. And when we're talking about dying, self-determination is a very important principle. With my experience, dying is about letting go. And if I talk about self-determined death, then we're talking about a concept which simply doesn't fit with the idea of letting go. It's like saying, I flew to Davos in my car. Either we're talking about dying or we're talking about preserving life and principles such as self-determination. And I believe that this issue of allowing, of accepting, is the most important one. In our daily experience, patients clearly express a wish, which is that I want to be allowed to die. Other patients want all possible medical interventions to preserve their life, and then that's what's done.
So in the Dutch, I'm confusing German and English. Also in the Dutch situation, it is so that we respect everyone's decision. So even the religious, because we have also got religious people of all kinds of sorts, and some religious people choose to go through the whole process and just want the natural way of dying without any interference, although they want medical interference, they want treatments and those kind of things. But the self-determination is what we respect. At the same time, I know that it is not an absolute principle, because it's in the Dutch situation, you're dependent of the willingness of the doctor. And also the doctor's the way of thinking is respected. So there are lots of doctors that say that they don't want to interfere in life-ending treatment, and they don't want to perform life-ending treatment for their own reasons, and if there's religious or anything else, that is not important, but it is respected. Mm-hmm. It's difficult for the patient, because when a patient, for instance, wants euthanasia because he's suffering unbearably and hopelessly, that are the primary criteria that are needed for performing euthanasia in the law, such a doctor have to find another, such a patient have to find another doctor, and that's sometimes a problem. Mm-hmm. So we, as the Dutch Right to Die Society, we try to help those people to give assistance and informants, so that they are helped to find a doctor that can help them.
Okay. Wir haben jetzt so ein bisschen eher die Theologie.
Well, we've had the theological perspective, Ms. Widmer-Schlumpf. Is there a perspective from government about how this self-determination could be seen? Well, I don't have a theological background, and I cannot give scientifically sound arguments from that perspective. I bring my religious and ethical position to bear on my views. And you're asking about what's the point of view of government. I've been asked, if you like, to submit a report on that. There are various levels. One is the theological point that's been addressed. One is the issue of individual responsibility. The other perspective is the responsibility of the state, of society. And the responsibility there is to allow people to live and to ensure that their life is protected. That's what I understand as being the role of the state. Then there's the question enshrined in the Constitution about individual responsibility, the right to choose, and that brings me to the question of what self-determination means. What is the right to choose? Can we have free choice? Is it really free? Is it as free as it should be in dealing with such a difficult issue? Or is it more manipulated? It is perhaps not free because there are perhaps social, family, financial problems which are related to it, and because the person might be old, one might feel a burden of expectation. Society expects me to die. My family is waiting for me to die. The health costs will go up if I live longer. And that brings me to an enormous problem of conscience, because I know that the role of the state is to protect individual responsibility, but at the same time we have to make sure that it comes from individual conviction and not as a result of social pressure. And then we move into the area of individuals who find themselves in a very difficult spiritual situation but want to continue living. Finally, I'd like to say that when I've been in old people's homes, I've seen that the desire to die is something that fluctuates. At times, it might be very pronounced and held as a firm conviction. 2 or 3 weeks later, it can have changed. And that's always left me with a lot to reflect upon. You've said that the wish to die should not be subject to social pressure. to social development, what kind of pressure are you talking about, and what kind of social developments influence such a wish? Well, if you assume today that the state shouldn't intervene when someone who is near to death decides, for whatever grounds, to die, it leads one to think that the government's reflection has to be influenced by the fact that there may be other pressures brought to bear on the individual's wish. And the discussion that we're having now, which is linked to the question of assisted death tourism as well, one is left with the question of when should the decision be taken, how long should be allowed to for a cooling off period after the decision. There is a clear effect that people are in desperate situations. They reach this kind of decision, but it might be influenced. Mrs. Jong, you've talked about the right to self-determination, and this is something that I think everybody can understand. But if I've understood correctly, your organization supports the right to choose to die regardless of age or health.
Und jetzt wird's kritisch, ja. Jetzt müssen wir da ein bisschen...
Yes, that's right. Okay, well, then that leads to the following question. You say that every individual at any time should be allowed to kill themselves, however old they are and however good their state of health.
Every Dutch citizen has the right to fill in his life and his dying the way they want within the boundaries of the law. And that means that every healthy or old man or woman can say that they don't want to go on living. But they are dependent of the doctor that must go with them, must see that their suffering is real, that they suffer of life. For instance, a 90-year-old man I know that he couldn't walk anymore, he couldn't read because he couldn't see, he couldn't hear music because he couldn't hear very good anymore, and he was suffering of life. He didn't want to go on, and he was able to convince his general practitioner to see that the man was suffering of life, and so that the criteria in the law to perform euthanasia were all there, so that this old man, although he didn't have cancer or he wasn't really ill, he had his euthanasia.
So active assistance was provided to a man who wasn't terminally ill, but he simply was suffering from life. Well, I think that's something that we could discuss because that becomes tricky in the Swiss context. Well, there is a social awareness of what's going on, and I'm full of respect for everybody who's involved in this area. If there is a right to put an end to one's life, then the consequence is that individuals have to help them in achieving that. If there is a right, it has to do with our vision of what a human is. A viable human, a human who is capable of enjoying life, is something which is important to our vision. And if we transpose that vision onto what we understand human life to be, then inevitably we understand that there's a point where I will say, okay, it's time to die. and perhaps primarily because I have an idea of what makes a life worthwhile. As the Federal Council has said, we have to be very clear about what the factors are which prompt people to arrive at that conclusion. For a while, I was asked by the insurance companies whether we would reflect upon the fact that the 30 final days of an individual's life are the most expensive. And therefore, and I would say this from a theological point of view, whether we can take full responsibility for putting an end to our lives. Finally, what has happened is that what we want to prevent is that people simply be put outside the cemeteries, not have a dignified end to their lives. I would have to speak out expressly against such a right because of all the consequences that come from it. Palliative care, on the other hand, is absolutely crucial. I'd like to hear then from Mr. Brents about what palliative care can offer. Mr. de Jong has talked about a case of someone who is tired of life. He cannot do what he used to do. What can palliative care offer in order to give him the possibility of living his life, of continuing to live his life? Palliative care is for people who are physically ill. Was he physically ill?
More, because arthrosis, I think that's a disease. Well, maybe he had a cough as well. Maybe he had some problems with breathing, but it wasn't cancer. It wasn't a well-defined disease, for instance. But also, palliative care is to make the suffering less. So it doesn't mean to be only for diseases. When someone can't walk because arthrosis, well, you can give palliative care for that to relieve, for instance, pain. But we know that, for instance, the way people want to die and die in dignity, pain is seldom the reason. It is tarnishing, it is decay of personality, it's all kind of other things than pain, for instance, that make that people don't, that they fear for dying not in dignity. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And that's why they give, for instance, advance directives, wherein that's a personal document wherein they write what they want and what they don't want. And especially the last part is so very important because, when you're not able to tell it to anyone anymore, others must know what you wanted so that, measures can be taken. Mm-hmm. What kind of measures that are?
What is the objective for you then? To kind of remove this obstacle of the doctor? To take the doctors with me. I would like that, if I understand you well, I would like to take the doctors with me so that they also have the mercy, but also the power and the courage to fulfill the help that they are asked for. And I think that doctors are helpers, are medical helpers, and they have to perform in that role.
Mm-hmm. Das staunt mich jetzt doch.
Well, that surprises me a little bit. You're a doctor yourself. I'm going to say it in an exaggerated way. You really want to turn doctors into accomplices in a way, for anyone who feels a bit fed up with life. I know it's exaggerated, this formulation.
It has to convince the doctor.
Yeah.
And when the doctor is not convinced, he will not be willing to fulfill the wish.
Also der besser reden.
So it's the one who is more convincing will die quicker and better.
Even people that are not well in speaking and not very good at saying what they want to, you know, for instance, like a general practitioner, mostly you know your patient for already 20 years, for instance, and so you know what someone wants.
Mm-hmm.
And when it's written down, it's even more clear.
Mm-hmm. Frau Bundesrätin Südlich.
Federal Councillor, what do you think about this? The Netherlands and Switzerland are the two countries in Europe which have the, so to speak, most liberal legislation in assisted death. Only there are differences, of course. We've just been told that in the Netherlands, active assisted death is permitted, though only if it is dispensed by doctors. In Switzerland, we have a different regulation or a different way of dealing with it. What do you feel about the Dutch way? Well, I never judge other countries' legislations. We have enough to do in our own country. Yes, but it could be taken as a basis for the Swiss legislation. No, I don't think so, says the Federal Councillor. I think one has to make a distinction here. We're talking about active, passive, or indirect assisted death, but what we are dealing with in Switzerland is assisted suicide and not dispensed by a doctor in a hospital. I just wonder about the Dutch system. How can it be reconciled with the mission that the doctor has to accomplish, or the intention that one has when one studies medicine, that one's supposed to help and alleviate pain and suffering? One is not supposed to help people die and give up life. I'm not talking about patients who are very sick or very old people who really don't want to go on, but what about healthy individuals? Is this really reconcilable with the medical ethics? That's the one thing. Now, I'm neither judging nor condemning this in any way. If a person wants to commit suicide, it saddens me, but I don't have the right to judge it. But in every case, I always wonder what society could have done differently in order to prevent it coming from such a situation to rise. May I ask, what do you mean by a healthy person? Well, this is a very difficult discussion that has already been touched upon by Parson Wipf. Is health healthy in medical terms? And what is the value of life? How do we assess and evaluate or value life subjectively? This is awfully complex. I think one has to defend principles in ethical ways and understand that some things cannot be regulated that are part of every individual self-determination. The state simply cannot support assisted death, even if it is given and helped by professionals. This is something a state should not do. Obviously, one can help members of the family if they are suffering terribly. There's a very important boundary here. So I find your Dutch model a bit difficult. I don't see how you reconcile it with the medical ethic. Just as I would find it difficult to understand if theologians were to help individuals end their own life. Obviously, we can discuss it for hours on end. Mrs. Rens? Yes, just very briefly about the Netherlands. I know that some doctors are in a difficult situation, in ethical conflict, then I'd also make the distinction between suicide on the one hand and assistance in the case of suicide on the other. I think we cannot exclude that we will never, ever be in such a situation of despair. This cannot be excluded. However, there are certain claims that arise from assisted suicide, and this lays a very heavy burden on the health carers, on hospital staff. There are all sorts of patients who suffer, who say, "You could kill me now, I have no dignity anymore." Their existence is totally without value, seen by them. And do you think that this arises from the fact that we are not really discussing this properly in Switzerland? Yes, this is something that has increased in the last 10 years. Parson Brip, you wanted to also add something? I'm very preoccupied by the fact that many people feel that they want to have the right to decide when the time comes to die. When these provisions were entered into the penal code in Switzerland, that is to say that assistance in the case of suicide, if it is done altruistically, is not criminal. For example, if a husband sees how much his wife is suffering and simply cannot act differently than, with all the means available, help his wife to die, not actively, as a kind of a service, as a friend, then this is not punishable in criminal terms. However, we are in a completely different situation today. There's been a shift. We are now saying, or considering, that people are fed up with life. Well, all of us are fed up with life at certain points in our life. How can we handle this right that people are laying claim to? Is it a service that one does, a good turn one does a friend, this assistance? But it certainly cannot be dispensed by the profession, the doctors or the health carers. Yes, this I think shows very clearly what your position is vis-à-vis of organizations in Switzerland that give assistance in dying. Now, Federal Councillor, what about the legislation in Switzerland? You have decided yourself that you want to examine the existing legislation, consider whether new rules have to be introduced. Are there certain moral, ethical standards that need to be introduced so that the assisted death is more or less regulated? And I think you will be submitting a proposal to the Federal Council. The proposal is already nearly ready. Could you tell us something about it? Well, you know, Mr. Lothar, that I cannot say anything about things that have not yet been discussed by the Federal Council yet, but we have a very intensive debate on the subject. And please do not believe that I decide what I undertake and what I don't undertake. The Federal Council hasn't developed that far. Cantons have submitted initiatives, Zurich, St. Gall, Basel, Basel-Land. These initiatives aim at having this subject discussed at the national level, that is to say, the organized assisted aid. There are all sorts of parliamentary proposals that have also been tabled. There's a report that dates back to 2006, and that was commissioned by the Federal Council, which only dealt with the issue whether Article 115 of the Penal Code suffices to manage and cope with this development. In 1937, the situation was quite different. In 1937, it was simply stated that assisted suicide which is altruistic, is not a penal act. In 1982, Exit was organized, and then Dignitas was set up, and the whole situation has changed. At the time, the Federal Council therefore asked itself whether the penal provisions were sufficient to cope with the way in which the whole situation has evolved. Subsequently, there were further developments which many of us, I myself included, could no longer accept morally and ethically. Now, you may be surprised that I say this as a lawyer. The matter needs to be discussed at a different level than exclusively at the penal level. There are certain ethical principles that have to be discussed, interpreted, understood, and which have to be abided by a society, so that we don't slip into a condition where life is no longer valued, that there's no value attached to life anymore. This is the big challenge, and in fact I will be making a proposal that is an addition to this Article 115 along the lines that the non-altruistic or the purely altruistic support to assisted suicide has to be defined very clearly according to certain rules, and where one also excludes the possibility of allowing doctors or healthcarers to dispense this, or that the whole thing become a trade or a profession or a craft. I'm not saying that solution should be to completely prohibit these organizations that wish to provide help to the dying, but these organizations have to have certain guidance that are clearly defined in ethical and moral terms. Does this mean then, says the moderator, you will try and do this via the Article 115 in the Penal Code with an additional provision? The answer is, well, it may be by modifying it or by addition. I'm not going to tell you exactly what it's going to be. Maybe, but there are certain alternatives. Either you can just let the whole thing develop as it freely, or you ban everything, you prohibit everything, but there nonetheless will be gray areas which will exist and grow, and that is probably not the right way to handle it either. There are some other solutions. For example, such situations should only be allowed under very clearly defined circumstances. You said very clearly a moment ago that this should not become an economic activity. But this then can only be prohibited if one makes lays certain conditions regarding costs. It is only the organizations will only be allowed to ask for a certain amount to be able to continue granting such help. Yes, of course, they should not be making a profit from such activity. It would have to remain a non-profit-making activity. So you're going to discuss this at the Federal Council. When can we expect any communication about this new regulation? I'm not going to give any dates, any time frames, because I'm usually wrong, or it turns out to be wrong, but sometime in this coming spring. Mrs. Renz, and I don't know what this new regulation will look like, but I would regret it very much if the aid to suicide were going to be regulated as a kind of a subsidiary provision. A lot has been happening in the area of palliative care. Federal Councillor Couchepin has authorized research in this area, and in August, a proposal will be submitted on aided assistance to death, and this is not just going to be pioneer work, but this is something that can be acceptable for the whole country. So I hope that this will have an impact and that nothing will be done before this is submitted. Are you saying that the kind of aid that is available in Senegal would be available in the whole country? Well, this is a kind of accompaniment to patients in their time of dying. From all points of view, it is medical, it is mental, psychological. We hope that this kind of system can be introduced at the national level. The canton of Senegal is playing a pioneer role, and I think the model would be very good for the whole country. So I hope very much that the Federal Council will not adopt something or propose something without waiting for what we are going to propose. We've discussed this for over 10 years, this subject of palliative care. I was at a symposium here in Davos on palliative care, but let's not forget the reality of what is happening every day. I think this is something we could accept, but we have to examine all of this together, see what means are available, what the possible solutions are. We have representatives of palliative care who are in our working party. It's not as if two trains were running in parallel. The working group of Mr. Couchepin is also cooperating very closely with ours. I think we have to get away from saying there's only one solution, from this black and white way of looking at things. I think we have to have a system that is ethically viable. Mrs. de Jong, and then we shall open up the discussion to the participants.
Country is different, of course, so that I think you can't say that the Dutch situation is comparable with the Swiss situation. The cultural differences, but since 2002 we have in Holland the law termination of life on request and assisted suicide act, and there in that law are very restricted situations described wherein life ending by a doctor is not punishable. And there is a review procedure on it. So that means that on every life-ending procedure, we have transparency. We exactly know how many, or in which cases, what the diseases were, what the circumstances were. And I know that, for instance, euthanasia and assisted dying is done in every country. But you need to get it transparent, and therefore, and that's what I have experienced myself while I was a doctor in that time, that since the law is there is transparency, and we can talk about it together, and we know what happens. And because of the researches, the figures we have, we know they are accurate.
Wobei, da muss man schon sagen, es gibt ja auch Kritiker.
Well, there are also critics who make the accusation against the government that they are hiding the figures, and that the actual figures in Poland are 2 or 3 times higher.
We know by research that it is not true, that the figures are accurate.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Mr. Münk, you wanted to speak, and then I wanted to open the audience to open the questions to the public. 10 years ago I was here, and I thought they were very lively people. It's strange then to be discussing this subject. Now, as you said, Mr. de Jong, the doctor is not at all in the hands of the patient. He is bound by his ethics and law. I think everybody agrees on that. And as far as I can see, all professional codes of conduct state very clearly that suicide and euthanasia are not part of the daily work of doctors. And this is something that's also in the code of the Swiss Association of Medical Scientists. However, there is a tolerance for such assistance, but the responsibility is with each individual doctor. It's not a simple solution. But if the role of the doctor is clearly defined, as it seems to be, then on the one hand it will be possible to act, but on the other hand we have to recognize that there is a grey zone, because under what criteria is he operating? So I think that there is a lack of clarity here with regard to the role of the doctor, and I couldn't close my eyes to such medical activities. So confusion is difficult to avoid. You talked about the right. What kind of right is it? The right to die, you say. It's obviously not a positive right. It's obviously not a human right, because the state would have to protect it at the same level as the right to life. So what kind of right is it? Well, it's not a right that can oblige others to conduct themselves in accordance to it. So it's a weak right, but it is a right. I won't argue with that fundamentally. Finally, on the role of the state, I think the state must intervene to establish the framework for the right or euthanasia, but I don't think it needs to set criteria for what is a worthy life. Thank you very much, Mr. Münk. I'd now like to open the floor, and we have a gentleman here, Mr. Verli, who is the president of EXIT in Switzerland, the largest pro-euthanasia organization in Switzerland. I'd like to give Mr. Verli the chance to share his thoughts. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to have been here for this discussion, and I'm very happy to see people with different opinions come together and discuss these issues civilly. In politics, I'm used to seeing a very different way of discussing such topics. A Reformed Church survey said that 72% of the Swiss population would be in favor of assisted suicide. Our own survey came up with exactly the same figure, 72%. So that's probably fairly accurate. And as a representative of the 72% who support euthanasia, we assist around 170 people a year who find themselves in a situation of hopeless suffering. And a similar number then decide not to proceed with their death. And that's nice to see, because once the authorization for euthanasia has been given, people feel that, well, if it's absolutely necessary, then I can die swiftly. But they choose not to take that option for the moment. And it allows people to have a decent death in their own home after taking sleeping pills where there are their nearest and dearest who are close to them. In 3/4 of the cases, that is the case. People die peacefully surrounded by their loved ones. So what is the basis for the provision of this help? First of all, the right of individual choice, self-determination. That is a human right, Mr. Münk. It's from the European Convention of Human Rights, and the Federal Court ruled 2 years ago in Switzerland that it was on the basis of this right that Swiss citizens could choose when and how they wanted to die. It is part of our freedom and human dignity in Switzerland. On the other hand, the government has a very important task, 3 in fact. One has already been mentioned. It has to facilitate, to allow people to live their lives, to protect the right to life. It's not possible to say that it's too expensive, we can't finance it. The state also has the task of guaranteeing this right of self-determination, and thirdly, it has the task of avoiding abuses. If somebody is forced to choosing death by their grandchildren, that is an abuse and it must be stopped. There is with us an annual contribution of 35 francs, and if someone then wishes to apply for authorization for euthanasia, it's free. So we are certainly a non-profit organization. Now, you mentioned the Swiss Academy of Medical Science. It has defined two fundamental objectives of medicine. Firstly, to heal, and secondly, to alleviate suffering. 30% of those who wish euthanasia with us are not terminally ill, but they are not happy, viable old age pensioners who feel that the time has come to die. That's a cliche, and it's wrong. It simply doesn't exist. As the case has been mentioned by Mrs. de Jong, in all of these cases, there is suffering, and doctors recognize that there are situations where suffering can only be alleviated by death. On the other hand, there's palliative medicine, which we support as well. We have an institution, Palliative, which is also a charity. And I would encourage Mrs. Rentz that if she needs money for her palliative program, she should come and visit Exit. We would happily support her projects. There's no contradiction there whatsoever. Thank you very much, Mr. Verley from Exit. A few other people wishing to take the floor. The gentleman there with the white jumper. My name is Mr. Zemper. I have two questions. You've spoken about leaving life. You talked about protecting life, but you haven't talked about leaving death, or leaving the body, or protecting the body. My question is, I'm moving in the physical universe, but I live in the spiritual, mental universe. I have a body, but I am not my body. So there is a distinction there, and I would be interested as to whether you could talk about that. And, well, would your vision speak for or against euthanasia? Well, my view is that with individual responsibility, one should be able to decide for oneself. So I'm in favor. But at the same time, as the gentleman from Exit said, I just wanted to say that it's important that we recognize these differences, especially the theologians, Mr. Münk, whether they could talk about that distinction, whether we're protecting life or whether we're protecting the physical body. And my conclusion would be that would be different depending on what vision you have. Well, first of all, yes, allow me to come back on what Mr. Verley has said. I'm curious, you said that it's a human right. Where is that in the European Human Rights Convention? Article 8? No, it's not, said Mr. Munk. The Council of Europe has decided otherwise, as you know. And the European Human Rights Convention doesn't enshrine that. It would be contradictory from the point of view of the Swiss Constitution to, on the one hand, stand for the right to life, and then the other hand to protect the right to death. That right simply cannot be found as a human right. On the question of protecting life and protecting life, The idea of life is an abstraction. All that we have actually are beings, living beings, and we simply have then the embodiment of what we recognize as life, and therefore life can be interpreted differently. There is no single standard interpretation of what life is. I see people as a mix of mental, spiritual, physical dimensions, and if I talk about life, I'm talking about the life of an individual who lives on all of these levels. Thank you, Mr. Münk. I think it's very important that we speak perhaps on what Mr. Verdi said. Well, yes, with all respect to you, Mr. Verdi, you are playing down a number of things. Your association and other have absolutely no transparency, no financial transparency at all. Secondly, because Article 115 of the Criminal Code doesn't describe, as difficult as it is, who in this situation should be able to provide such assisted suicide. Are you the ones who would actually define that? Are you the ones who would define also who is allowed to benefit from assisted suicide? I also have learned, ladies and gentlemen, that one needs to be very cautious in communicating with these organizations, because what I think it's important to say is that while palliative care, namely the indirect assisted death, where there is medicine which is provided in light of an upcoming death, and that is can also be understood as an assistance. There has been a discussion on who should be assisted. Now, I think that in society it's very important to make this definition. At the same time, it's very important to be transparent. Because of a loophole in the law, you've been able to occupy a position which we really need now to reflect upon and discuss as a society and regulate. So, we now have to keep this conversation manageable. Mr. Fesenbeck, I'd like to hear from, and then Mr. Mirelli, and then when you make your comments, please keep your intervention short, otherwise I'll interrupt you. Thank you very much for giving me the floor. I'm a member of the board of Exit. I'm a pensioner. I'm also a former pastor. And we have 3 such reverends on the board, or former priests. We have 52,000 members who receive our newsletters where everything is clearly stated, including our finances. We also have a supervisory body which oversees us. So everything is clearly regulated. Every member can get information about what has been done with our money. We are also supervised and monitored by the Public Attorney's Office, and perhaps one thing that illustrates this well is that half of our revenues come from physicians, general physicians, and others by other individuals who work with Exit. Mr. Mirelli, can I ask you to make a brief intervention? The President of Dignitas. General Secretary. We don't have a President, actually. Yes, I'll be very brief and just follow up on the question of whether it's a human right or not. The Federal Court, in its decision 133, Roman 158, stated literally that the right of an individual to decide where and how he or she wants to die is part of the right to self-determination. And the right to self-determination is supported by Article 8, Paragraph 1 of the European Human Rights Convention. So the Federal Court has identified this right, recognized it as a human right. The Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, when discussing euthanasia, has had different discussions. The fact that they might have had a different interpretation is irrelevant. What's important is the view of the Federal Court. The main plaintiff complained because the doctor wouldn't write him a prescription for the drugs. He should have the state right. He should have a state guaranteed right to get these medicines. And the Federal Court says that he needed a doctor's expertise. He wrote to 150 psychiatrists in the Basel region and asked whether they could write a report on him, and the organization of psychiatrists defended themselves against the accusation that reports should be written by such psychiatrists. And then the appellant went to the European Court of Human Rights and said that the Federal Court in Switzerland was establishing a condition that simply could not be fulfilled. This appeal was given priority, and it is expected that in the foreseeable future the European Court of Human Rights will be ruling on this decision, and then we will know whether the European Court of Human Rights, which is responsible for this question, will recognize it as a human right. Thank you very much, Mr. Mileni. Federal Councillor, you wanted to say something? Yes. As a legal expert, I'd follow up on what you said, Mr. Minelli. The Federal Court did not say, or let's say it positive way around, the Federal Court recognized that every individual may decide how they leave life and where and when. They didn't recognize the right to suicide, and I think that's the right way round. As a society, we cannot recognize the right to suicide. We have to ask what could have been done differently. The Federal Court didn't say that euthanasia organizations who have a certain structure, membership structure, and have revenues should be allowed. They simply said that every individual should have the right and the possibility to die if they feel it is right to do so. That is the question then. How in our law does this question stand then? Is it the altruistic right, the assistance to help individuals leave life without any profit coming from that, or is this situation such that there needs to be a framework to allow these organizations to exist within certain restrictions? A couple more questions then. The gentleman here at the center who's just standing up. Yes, the microphone to this gentleman, please. Brief introduction, please, and then your question.
I'm a former GP in Bülach, and I'd like to put a question to the Federal Councillor. You try and prevent economic activity being generated from assisted death by means of the law, but many people would very much like to have this possibility of ending their life. So wouldn't it perhaps be better to find the proper legal provisions allowing this, permitting this? Are you saying that every individual should have the right of having their life prolonged by medical means? Yes, that goes without saying, but we're talking about the opposite. It is a decision that individuals can take if they don't want any life-prolonging treatment. That is something that we can support. But it's true that your question, too, has to be included in the discussion. I don't know whether I understood the question properly. You were saying that very often life is prolonged for commercial reasons, for profit-making reasons. We cannot hear the person in the audience. Well, I understood you to say, says the Federal Council, that someone should have the right to speak out against life-prolonging measures. I agree with this. I support you. But if I misunderstood you, could you put your question once more, or is everything fine? Everything okay? No. Could you specify your question once more? I'm not trying to accuse anyone of this being done, but if I cannot defend myself anymore, then it's often the case that for commercial reasons, actions are undertaken, measures are adopted that go against what I would have liked or accepted. And this is a problem of such a highly insured, comprehensively insured world. Yes, that is a problem. And this is a problem that we try and deal in another way. When a patient can still decide compos mentis what is to happen and sign such a document, then the family and the doctors will know later on that this will and wish has to be respected. This is certainly a solution. Now, a response from Mr. Whip. I would like to confirm this. The decisions and wishes of patients are very important. We are also dealing with this kind of written wish of patients, a Christian form of this. We feel that there's a need of transfer of substantial means from high-tech medical treatment to palliative care. Well, the question whether this will happen is debatable. I'd like to add something, says Mrs. Renz. The dying aren't just suffering. We are simply talking about people, a group of people who are very impressive in their posture. Very often the dying signal that they are still feeling well, that they are not doing that badly. But I don't think that we should be pushed into aiding suicide and death simply because we are afraid to see how they are suffering. Next question. The man with the shirt. I'm a doctor and I also support the palliative care and the Society for Palliative Care. I only want to say something about very seriously sick individuals and the dying, and I'm not going to say anything about the others. Self-determination is to have the knowledge, the self-knowledge also about what is going to happen and to take a decision about that. I've never been in the position of dying, but I see very many dying patients. They have the symptoms, and they have pain, fear, family conflict. All these symptoms interact and compound one another, and they can be alleviated by a team that thinks about these symptoms and makes a diagnosis and then gives a proper treatment. Sometimes, not always, thanks to adequate good quality palliative care, these people who really wanted to die actively find some meaning in their life and can bear their suffering until the end of their life. I'm not saying that it's easy, Mrs. Wren said the same. I'm always very surprised by these situations. Had I known this beforehand, I wouldn't have assisted patients in their death. Patients do come with their living wills, but we have to offer them another solution, another outcome as well. There's a great need for trust in such a process as well. So what we need to do is give the proper support and care. Thank you for that statement. The lady. I have a question for the Federal Councillor. About 12 years ago, I was a catechist and I was condemned. I wasn't given any hope for life anymore. I have survived. I have a grandchild. Then for 7 years, I have no pension fund and no health fund anymore. All doctors where I live know about my situation. Now I would like to die. And if it is not possible in 2012 in Geneva or in 2020, because Mrs. Clinton is now in charge, I would like to decide how I die. I would like to inject myself, and I would like to die in an oven in Bern. And my wish is that my ashes will be distributed, because I have no chance, opportunity of continuing to live in Switzerland. I don't want my daughter to have to look after my grave. Thank you very much, Federal Councillor. I hope you will find a solution.
Ich glaube, das würde ich gerne einfach so stehen lassen.
Thank you very much. I don't think this calls for any comment. This is a statement of someone who's experienced a lot of anguish and despair. A further request for the floor here at the front.
Mein Name ist Christoph Göllig.
Christoph Göllig. I'm from St. Gall. There's so much we have to do in our life. We have to leave our mother's womb, and then we have to go to school, and then we have to work. And those who haven't understood how to evade it have to pay a church tax, an ecclesiastical tax, and income tax. Sometimes we get something, and we also have to die. Now, if I want to die, then I can find a way and the means, as long as I have two healthy arms. Otherwise, Mrs. Rentz in St. Gall is there to help me. I've also been at the side of 3 persons who were dying. There was an unknown person whom I helped to be admitted to hospital. The policeman there involved didn't help me. I've also accompanied an aunt of mine, and so on and so forth. But I can tell you, I can find the ways and means to end my life when I think that the time has come. And I will not ask you, Mr. Münk. I'd rather tend to getting help and advice from the right-hand side of the panel. Thank you. The lady in the middle there.
Halten Sie noch mal, ja, Sie stehen auf, dann weiß man, wer es ist. Genau, das Mikrofon ist unterwegs.
Ich heiße Ursula Major.
Ursula Major, and I have a question for Mrs. de Jong. You have an Alzheimer's patient who's just started suffering from Alzheimer, who asks for your advice or help. This patient knows what the outcome of Alzheimer is and does not want to be a burden for his family. At what point can such a patient turn to you for help? Because later on, in the course of the disease, it's not possible anymore, only at the beginning of this terrible disease.
Problem, and it's one of our spearheads at the moment from the NVVE, the patients with beginning Alzheimer, because that are the patients that still can talk about what they want, what their wishes are, and they know what their future is. And we just had, a few months ago, we had a film, a document there about a man with Alzheimer, and he didn't want to go the whole process to the end, so he asked his general practitioner to help him to die in a dignified way, and she refused. And she didn't want to help him in what kind of way soever. So he had to solve his problem by getting medicine from abroad or from internet, and in the end of the film he took the medicine and he died after 4 days. So that was not what he wanted, but that was the outcome. We realize that when we assist these kind of patients, that probably people will die earlier if they get their wish fulfilled than they should die, because the moment that they still can talk about what they wish, that's not really the moment that they say they don't want that kind of situation anymore. They don't want the situation from what we know from Alzheimer, that they are not able to say anything or to recognize people or to take to be in life still. So we realize that if patients like that get their wishes fulfilled, they will die earlier. And that's the consequence probably of not taking advanced directive as serious as it is actually.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Herzlichen Dank, Frau.
Thank you, Mrs. de Jong. Further questions from the floor? The gentleman in the second row. I'm Gerard von Ax from Alton. I'm a doctor. I swore the oath to help way in the past. One thing that has not really been discussed very much here today is the social, economic and political aspects of dying. I have often seen patients who have or would have been able to have a worthy life had they had the right social environment, or if they didn't have the bad conscience of being old and therefore nothing should be done for them anymore because that was going to cost money. I think this is an aspect that has to be included as well in this discussion. I know that the new law will be in very good hands, being in Mrs. Widmer-Schlumpf's hands. Mr. Witz? Yes, that is a very decisive element. If we look at the various societies around the world, we know that there are some societies and cultures that are more caring, and I'm not trying to idealize them, but I think we have to give ourselves a new culture of mutual respect and caring for one another. It's always a cry for help, a cry for protection and warmth when people try and commit suicide or commit suicide. I don't think that this should become a normal option or alternative, and that's why I'm so much against it being an economic activity. Mrs. Rentz, yes, let me support that very clearly. Patients or individuals who suffer have their dignity. So can we look at dignity again? Dignity is inalienable and has to be part of our being and of our life. I would say that dying is a cultural good. We have protection of historical monuments, but we don't have any protection for this cultural good of dying, especially dignified dying, says the moderator. One last question from the gentleman in the blue jacket. A question for the theologians. I'm a tourist here. I'm a guest here. Did Jesus determine his own life and death? If so, his death was suicide. And in that case, human beings, we should also be allowed to determine our own death. Or did his father, force him into death, even though Jesus prayed to God and said, Father, please do not force me to drink from this goblet. But he said, your will be done. If this is the case, then it was assassination, it was murder committed by the Father. So how do we understand and interpret Jesus' death? Can we pass on this question to Mr. Wipp and Mr.
Nein, ich möchte gern von Ihnen eine Antwort. Ja.
Ja, ich bin etwas erstaunt, dass Sie auf diese Fährte kommen.
Well, I'm quite surprised by this track you've taken. You cannot attribute human causality to God. So there's no competition between man and God. There's a very unusual and exceptional relationship between man and God. And I don't think we can use this as an example in this discussion. You are assuming then that the same relations existed between Jesus and God as between human beings, and that's not the case, of course. Mr. Wipp? It is a very important question, and it would be nice if we could deal with it, discuss it unpolemically. It's really, at the end of the day, the question of what it is to be a human being, and Jesus, after all, gave himself up into the hands of God. After life, we will be sheltered by God. It's a very important question, of course, but let's not turn it into polemic. Dying is part of living. The Protestant churches have taken the stand and say that the Ars Moriendi has to be revived. Dying is a very important part of living, and let's not shorten it. Let's deprive it of pain and quality, give it as much quality of life, but not simply mechanically say, now it's over, especially not under the pressure from the outside.
Also ich stelle fest, dass diese Frage auch
even if this question were not put polemically, it is still not easily answered in theological terms. May I conclude this debate? In a last round, perhaps all of you could say very briefly, in one or two sentences, what your fundamental conviction is, and this would summarize the discussion very briefly. This is something that the participants could take with them. May I start with you, Mrs. Rent? What is the leading idea and principle that you would like to give to the participants?
Well, I would distinguish between God and icons. Well, I don't want to hear that. I want a message for the people here to take home. Well, my most important message is that dying is something which is very impressive.
Dying is something we're all going to go through, and I think our dying process should be improved.
Improved. Gut, verbessert. Ich weiß noch nicht genau, wie das funktioniert.
Good, okay, improved. I'm not sure how it can be improved, but it sounds good. Mr. Münk, can I turn to you? What's your primary message? 2 sentences. We must not die at the hand of another and protect our own right to life.
Herr Wipp, Ihre wichtigste Botschaft?
Well, the impression that my impression is that we are talking about something which concerns us all, and that we are discussing in society. We need to discuss it in society, and life and death go together. Dying is a part of living. Thank you very much. Federal Councillor, the final word to you. Final message to so many people who've come to Davos today. Well, as you've seen, as we've all seen, it's a very difficult subject, and what we have to avoid as a society is something that Dr. Phonax has said, is turning this into some kind of cost question which would decide over life or death. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to you for your attention and to all of the members of the panel who've been sitting up here. Thank you very much and have a good afternoon.